perfect neighborhood. The night air smelled faintly of cedar and fresh-cut grass, a kind of peace that only existed in planned neighborhoods where everything looked too symmetrical to be real. The streetlights along Willow Glen Loop glowed a buttery gold, illuminating identical driveways lined with hybrid hydrangeas. If you drove past quickly, you'd think you were looking at a postcard. Beautiful homes, trimmed lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs filled with laughter echoing from backyards. But the beauty of Willow Glen was only skin deep, and beneath its symmetry, something was wrong. My name is Ethan Cole, and I moved here 2 years ago with my wife Mara, after saving for nearly a decade. We'd both grown up with very little. She was a nurse who worked double shifts, and I ran a modest carpentry business that mostly dealt with home repairs. When we first saw the for sale sign on the pale yellow house with white shutters and a maple tree in the front yard, it felt like a dream come true. It was everything we had hoped for, a place to raise our future child, a quiet and safe community where everyone smiled when they passed by. At least, that's what it looked like on the surface. The Homeowners Association, Willow Glen Estates HOA, was famous for its standards. Every fence had to be the same height, every mailbox identical, every flower approved from a list of acceptable botanical aesthetics. It was laughable, really. I thought the rules were excessive, but Mara found it kind of charming. "It means people care," she had said the first week we moved in. I remember smiling, believing her. That was before we met Valerie Henson, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, our very own HOA Karen. Valerie was the kind of person who spoke like she was delivering a sermon. Everything she said dripped with certainty and control. She was in her late 50s, wore blazers even while walking her dog, and always had a clipboard tucked under one arm like it was an extension of her spine. She had been the HOA president for 11 years, re-elected every term because no one dared run against her. Her husband had left years ago. Some whispered he had escaped, and she lived alone in the corner house with the manicured rose bushes that bloomed year-round. At first, our encounters were civil. When Mara introduced herself, Valerie had given her a tight smile and said, "Welcome to Willow Glen. I hope you understand that we have standards here." The word standards was always delivered like a warning. I didn't think much of it then. The first few months passed peacefully. Mara and I planted a few lavender bushes in the front yard, painted the mailbox to match our shutters, and hung a small wind chime on the porch. Life was quiet, simple, and sweet. We'd sit outside in the evenings with glasses of lemonade, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. And then, when Mara found out she was pregnant, it felt like our lives had finally reached their golden moment. I remember the day she told me. She came running out of the bathroom, barefoot, holding a small test stick with trembling hands. "Ethan," she said, her voice breaking, "we're going to have a baby." I picked her up and spun her around right there in the kitchen, tears streaming down both our faces. We spent that entire night talking about names, about what kind of nursery we'd build, about how we wanted our child to grow up surrounded by kindness and calm. We didn't know that our happiness had just painted a target on our backs. It started small. A letter taped to our door, neat handwriting on Willow Glen letterhead. "Dear residents, your recent installation of a decorative sign, Baby on Board, is a violation of HOA Code 3B, non-regulated signage. Kindly remove it within 48 hours to maintain the neighborhood's visual harmony. V. Henson, HOA President." Mara read it and laughed. She's joking, right? But I'd already learned enough about Valerie to know she never joked. Still, we decided to ignore it. It was a harmless sign on the mailbox, bright yellow with little footprints. The next morning it was gone. At first I thought maybe the wind had blown it away, but the screws were still in the wood. Someone had removed it carefully. Later, we checked our doorbell camera footage, and there she was. Valerie in her blazer and pearls unscrewing the sign at 6:02 a.m., placing it into a folder like it was contraband, and walking away without a glance at the camera. Mara was furious, but I told her to let it go. "We'll pick our battles," I said. "We're not giving her power over us." But Valerie wasn't done. A week later, she knocked on our door while Mara was out for a checkup. I answered, half expecting another complaint about lawn height or mailbox color. Instead, she gestured toward the small stroller we'd left in the carport. "That," she said, pointing her pen at it, "is public clutter. It must be stored inside your garage. We have rules about outdoor visibility of personal items. It's a stroller, I said. It's temporary. Temporary becomes permanent, she replied coldly. That's how disorder begins, I bit my tongue. There was no reasoning with her. That evening, Mara came home exhausted from work, rubbing her belly, and I told her about the encounter. She looked disheartened but tried to smile. Let's just keep our peace, she said. I don't want stress right now. But Valerie had already decided she was on a crusade. Over the next few weeks, she began patrolling past our house almost every evening, walking slower each time, taking photos on her phone. When Mara went for walks in the morning, Valerie followed, always at a distance, always pretending to inspect something on her clipboard. She'd stop, jot down notes, glance up, and then move again like a hawk circling its prey. Mara started avoiding walks altogether. I noticed the shift in her eyes, how she'd peek through the curtains before stepping outside, how she'd clutch her belly protectively even when no one was around. I tried to comfort her, telling her we'd move after the baby was born, but she shook her head. We shouldn't have to run, Ethan, she said quietly. We've done nothing wrong. Then came the email, sent from the official HOA account, addressed to all residents of Willow Glen. Subject, community image and responsibility. As you may have noticed, one household has chosen to prominently display lifestyle choices that draw unnecessary attention and disrupt the visual unity of our community. While we respect personal circumstances, such overt displays can negatively affect property values and the family-friendly but decorum-oriented atmosphere we strive to maintain. Residents are reminded that public spectacles, including visible medical conditions, must be handled discreetly. V. Henson, HOA president. The phrasing was unmistakable. She was talking about us, about Mara's pregnancy. It was no longer just control. It was humiliation. Our neighbors started whispering apologies when they passed us. Some even avoided eye contact altogether, not wanting to be seen as choosing sides. A few brave souls like Mrs. Patel from next door quietly told us, "We're so sorry. She's done this before. She picks someone every year." Still, we tried to live normally, but Valerie wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, we woke up to find an orange sticker plastered on our front door. Notice of pending review, non-compliance with community harmony standards. Underneath, scribbled in her handwriting, potential liability due to visible pregnancy during common area use. That was the day something inside me broke. I called the HOA's legal office, but they brushed me off, said any complaint must be filed formally through the president. I contacted the city housing department, but they said HOAs were largely self-regulated. Document everything, one sympathetic clerk advised. It'll help if this escalates. I didn't know it then, but that advice would end up saving us. In the days that followed, Valerie's harassment reached a fever pitch. She began patrolling the sidewalk in a golf cart outfitted with a loudspeaker, making announcements about community integrity. Sometimes she'd stop in front of our house, tapping on her clipboard, muttering to herself. Once, she even installed a small motion sensor near our mailbox, claiming it was for security. Later, I'd learned she'd labeled it belly tracker in the HOA records. It was like living under surveillance. Then, one late afternoon, everything shifted. Mara was in her 8th month, tired but glowing, her belly round and radiant beneath a soft sundress. She wanted to sit outside for a while just to feel the breeze. I brought her lemonade and we sat on the porch trying to pretend everything was normal. The sunlight shimmered through the maple leaves, and for a brief, blissful moment, it felt like peace had returned, until Valerie's golf cart came into view. She parked at the curb, scribbled something in her notebook, and then, without warning, strode up our walkway. Her face was pale and taut, eyes burning with some self-righteous fury. "You were warned," she said sharply. "You've continued to disrupt the neighborhood's visual standard." I stood, placing myself between her and Mara. "Enough, Valerie. You're trespassing. This is community property," she snapped. "I'm inspecting for compliance." "No," I said firmly. "You're harassing my wife." She ignored me, her gaze darting to Mara's belly as if it offended her very soul. "This display," she hissed, "is indecent. We don't allow such—" "Such what?" Mara cut in softly, her voice trembling but defiant. "Life, hope, joy?" Valerie's lips twisted. "You're making a scene." "Leave," I said, my voice low. She didn't. Instead, She took a single deliberate step forward, her pen pointing like a weapon. "You're in violation." That was when Mara winced, gripping her belly, and something in Valerie's eyes changed. Something snapped. Before I could move, before I could even process what was happening, she lashed out, her clipboard swinging toward Mara in a sudden, vicious motion. It struck her just below the ribs. Mara gasped and stumbled backward, her lemonade glass shattering against the porch. The world tilted. I caught her as she fell, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Valerie froze, eyes wide, realizing what she'd done. But even then, she started shouting. She attacked me. I was defending myself. She lunged. The neighbors' doors opened. Someone screamed. And somewhere down the street, a siren began to wail. That was the moment everything began to unravel. The night. Everything changed. The world blurred into sirens, blue strobes and the frantic rustle of neighbors spilling into the street. My arms were locked around Mara as she gasped for breath, one hand clutching her belly where Valerie's clipboard had struck. Time became a haze of noise and terror, the kind that lives in slow motion. I remember her fingers digging into my shirt, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Ethan, the baby, something's wrong." And that was all it took for panic to rip through me like fire through dry grass. I laid her gently across the back seat of our car, my mind spinning, every instinct screaming that I needed to move and to get her help. But the sirens were growing closer, echoing through the cul-de-sac. I saw the reflection of flashing lights bouncing off windows and the pale faces of our neighbors gathering in clusters, phones out, filming, whispering. Somewhere, someone was yelling for me to wait for the ambulance, but my entire body was on autopilot, the kind of desperate focus that comes when you love someone too much to think logically. Then the first patrol car turned the corner, its lights cutting through the twilight. 2 officers jumped out, one heading toward me, the other straight toward Valerie, who stood frozen at the edge of the porch. Her face was pale under the flood of flashing red and blue, her clipboard still clutched in one trembling hand like a shield of authority. When she saw the officers, she suddenly pointed toward me and screamed, "He attacked me! He's dangerous!" She fell because of him. The words hit me like a slap, but I didn't even have time to respond. The second officer, a tall man with a calm but firm expression, stepped between us and raised his hand. "Ma'am, we'll get your statement. Please step back." I turned to the other officer, voice cracking as I tried to explain. "She's 8 months pregnant. She was hit. Please, I need paramedics now." Within seconds, an ambulance pulled up beside the cruiser. The paramedics rushed out, moving with that practiced urgency that comes from experience. One of them, a young woman with dark curls tucked into her cap, knelt beside Mara and began assessing her. The other started asking me questions. How far along was she? Where had she been struck? Had she lost consciousness? My answers came out between shallow breaths. My world was narrowing to the sound of my wife's labored breathing and the paramedics' calm but urgent instructions. They loaded her into the ambulance, strapping monitors around her belly, and I climbed in beside her. Through the window, I could see Valerie still standing there on our porch, surrounded by flashing lights. She wasn't crying, wasn't apologizing, she was arguing. Her voice carried across the street. I was acting in defense of property. They were creating a disturbance. "You can't arrest me for doing my duty." The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, sealing us in a sterile cocoon of white light and antiseptic air. I held Mara's hand all the way to St. Andrew's Medical Center, whispering useless words like, "You're okay," and "It's going to be fine." But the truth was, I didn't know if it would. I could see the fear in her eyes, not just for herself, but for the tiny life she was carrying. At the hospital, the world became a blur of motion. Doctors, nurses, beeping monitors, and fluorescent lights. The strange chaos of emergency medicine that feels both immediate and infinite. They whisked Mara into a private room, started an IV, and hooked her up to fetal monitors. I sat outside the door, hands shaking, heart hollow. Every second felt like an hour. When the doctor finally emerged, her expression was serious but calm. "Mr. Cole," she said, pulling down her mask. "Your wife has some abdominal bruising, but we've done an ultrasound. The baby's heartbeat is strong. We'll need to keep her overnight for observation, but right now things look stable." Stable. It was the most beautiful word I had ever heard. Relief hit me so hard that my knees nearly gave out. I thanked her. I don't even remember what I said, just that my voice was raw from holding everything in. When I went back into the room, Mara was awake, pale but smiling faintly. I sat beside her bed and kissed her forehead, tears running down my face before I even realized they were there. For a few hours, the chaos outside didn't matter. There was only her and the quiet rhythmic sound of our baby's heartbeat echoing from the monitor. A fragile, steady reminder that life was still fighting to stay. But peace never lasts long in a place like Willow Glen. By morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, texts, voicemails from neighbors who had seen everything, and then an email from the HOA office. The subject line made my stomach drop. Emergency HOA notice. Incident of disorderly conduct. Pending review. I opened it with shaking hands. Dear residents, we regret to inform you that a disruptive event occurred last night involving the Coles at 112 Maple Ridge. There was an altercation resulting in police presence, causing distress among neighbors. The HOA is conducting an internal review to determine appropriate action regarding the Coles' violations of neighborhood harmony and conduct standards. V. Henson, HOA president. She was still pretending to be in charge, still spinning her narrative even while police reports and witness footage existed. The audacity of it made my blood boil. But beneath the anger, something colder began to take root. Resolve. By afternoon, an officer from the local precinct visited the hospital to take our statements. His name was Detective Harris, a man with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many suburban disputes turn ugly. He took notes while I described everything, the harassment, the letters, the stalking, the final assault. When I showed him the video footage from our doorbell camera, Valerie raising her clipboard, the impact, Mara collapsing, his jaw tightened. That's more than harassment, he said quietly. That's assault on a pregnant woman. Felony level. He took our statements formally and promised that an arrest warrant was already being processed. She's at the station right now, he added. Claims she was acting in defense. But the footage is clear. When he left, Mara turned to me, her eyes tired but fierce. Ethan, she whispered, I don't just want her arrested. I want people to know what she's done. All of it. And that's when the idea started forming, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. We weren't the first people Valerie had bullied. The whispers from our neighbors, the fear, the silence, it all made sense now. This wasn't about one attack. It was about years of unchecked cruelty disguised as authority. That evening, after making sure Mara was resting comfortably, I drove back home. The street was eerily quiet. The yellow tape had been removed, but the air still felt charged, heavy with the echoes of what had happened. I parked in the driveway and stood for a long time just staring at the porch, the shattered glass still glinting faintly under the light. Inside, the house felt smaller, claustrophobic. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, printed letters, emails, screenshots of Valerie's insane HOA posts, and the footage from the security cameras. Then I went door to door speaking to neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up. To my surprise, they were ready now. Mr. Patel showed me text messages where Valerie had threatened fines for having guests over too often. Mrs. Chu handed me a stack of notices about her unsanctioned flower pots. Even the Andersons, who usually kept to themselves, confessed that Valerie had once reported them for leaving their curtains open too late at night. It was a pattern of control, manipulation, and harassment. And now, finally, it was all going to come to light. By the time I returned home, it was well past midnight. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by evidence, exhaustion pressing at the edges of my vision. But I wasn't tired and I was focused. For years, Valerie had built her little empire of fear through silence. That silence was over. When the morning sun crept through the blinds, I drove straight to the Maple Hollow Police Department and handed everything over to Detective Harris. He listened quietly as I spoke, flipping through pages of documents and shaking his head in disbelief. You've done half our job for us, he said finally. This is more than one incident. This is systemic abuse of power. That afternoon, Valerie was officially charged with second-degree assault, harassment, and stalking. They also added an HOA misconduct violation under municipal code, a charge rarely used but perfectly fitting. The news spread through Willow Glen like wildfire. By evening, the HOA group chat, once a hub of Valerie's self-righteous announcements, was filled with shocked messages. Some were defensive, some sympathetic, but most were relieved. The spell had broken. People who had lived under her rule for over a decade were finally realizing they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Still, victory didn't feel sweet. That night, as I sat beside Mara's hospital bed holding her hand, all I could think about was how close we'd come to losing everything. I kept replaying the moment over and over, the way Valerie's eyes had flashed, the way Mara had gasped, and each time it hit harder. There are moments in life that permanently divide time, before and after. For us, that was one of them. But what Valerie didn't know, or what she would soon learn, was that her reign of control had created something far stronger than fear. It had united an entire community that she'd spent years dividing, and by the end of it, her name, once spoken with dread, would become a warning of what happens when power and cruelty go unchecked. The next morning, I received a call from Detective Harris. His tone was firm, almost grim. "She's been transferred to county for evaluation," he said. "The mental health team recommended a 72-hour psychiatric hold before formal processing. She's claiming insanity?" I asked quietly. "She's claiming divine authority," he replied flatly. "She told the officers she was enforcing a moral law above municipal regulation." I exhaled slowly. It wasn't just control anymore. It was delusion. As I hung up and looked over at Mara, sleeping peacefully with one hand resting on her belly, something inside me hardened. Not with anger, but with purpose. We were going to rebuild from this, not just for ourselves, but for everyone Valerie had hurt. Because sometimes the worst kind of villain doesn't wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes she carries a clipboard and calls it righteousness, and by the time we were done, that clipboard would never hold power over anyone again. The reckoning. The morning after Valerie's arrest, Willow Glen felt like a neighborhood waking from a long and feverish dream. The air was different and still crisp, still suburban perfect, but now laced with the uneasy awareness that something sacred had been broken. For years, Valerie Henson had been the silent pulse of this place, her rules dictating every petal, every porch light, every blade of grass. Without her, the neighborhood seemed unsure how to breathe. Mailboxes still stood in perfect rows. Lawns still shimmered with dew, but the symmetry had lost its soul, and somehow that emptiness was a relief. When I drove through the cul-de-sac that morning, I noticed small, subtle acts of rebellion blooming like wildflowers. Someone had hung a colorful wind spinner in their front yard. Another had painted their door a shade of blue that wasn't on the approved palette. The Hendersons' kids were drawing chalk rainbows on the sidewalk without fear of a fine. It was as if people were testing the air, realizing the world wouldn't end just because Valerie wasn't there to police it. At the hospital, Mara was improving. The bruises were fading into faint shadows, and her spirit was stronger each day. When I walked in with a coffee and a small bouquet of daisies, she smiled softly. "You look tired," she said. I laughed under my breath, sinking into the chair beside her. "You're the one in a hospital bed and you're worried about me?" "That's what love does," she said simply. Her fingers brushed mine, gentle but sure. "Have you heard anything more?" I nodded. "They're keeping her under observation. The charges are holding, and Harris said the DA's office wants to pursue the case fully." "Good," Mara whispered, though her voice was heavy. "I don't want revenge, Ethan. I just want peace. For us. For everyone she hurt." Her words settled deep inside me. That was Mara, soft but strong, always leading with grace even when the world turned cruel. I promised myself right there that I'd fight for that peace no matter what it took. When she was finally discharged a few days later, I wheeled her out of the hospital into the golden light of afternoon. The sky was clear and impossibly blue, as if the world had decided to start over. But the moment we turned onto our street, I saw a crowd gathered near our driveway. My heart tensed for a second until I realized they weren't there to protest. They were there to help. Mr. Chu, the retired engineer with a heart as big as his azaleas, was fixing our broken porch railing. The Patel twins were sweeping up shattered glass. Mrs. Henderson had brought over a casserole, and a handful of other neighbors stood awkwardly by, offering tools, food, or just quiet smiles. For a moment I couldn't speak. The same people who once avoided eye contact out of fear now stood in unity, rebuilding what Valerie had tried to destroy. Mara squeezed my hand. "They're not afraid anymore," she said softly. "She doesn't own them." I felt something tighten in my throat. "No," I said. She never did. Over the next few days, the house filled with warmth again, not just from the food and the company, but from a deeper kind of healing. People began stopping by just to talk, sharing their stories about Valerie. Each tale was a small tragedy wrapped in bureaucracy. A family fined for painting their fence 2 shades too light, an elderly widow threatened over a non-conforming bird feeder, a teenager written up for parking his bike on the sidewalk. Every story carried the same thread: fear of retaliation, silence, submission, and yet now, freed from her watchful gaze, those same voices grew louder, bolder, stronger. A few days later, I received a call from Detective Harris. "We'll be moving forward with a public hearing," he said. "There's more than enough evidence, and the HOA board has called for an emergency re-election meeting. I think you should be there." I hesitated for a moment, remembering the way that community hall once felt like Valerie's throne room. But then I thought of Mara, of our baby, of the neighbors who finally dared to breathe. "We'll be there," I said. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the Willow Glen clubhouse, a building that Valerie had once ruled like her personal court. The air was electric with tension. Every seat was taken, and even the standing space at the back was packed. The same neighbors who had spent years whispering behind closed doors now filled the room, their eyes sharp with anticipation. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, looking pale and uneasy. In the center chair was Mark Ellison, the vice president, a mild, balding man who had spent years in Valerie's shadow. He cleared his throat nervously and began. "Tonight," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we address the future of Willow Glen. As you all know, our former president, Ms. Henson, has been relieved of her duties following serious criminal allegations. We will review community concerns and elect new leadership." The room murmured in agreement. A few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react to the fall of someone who had once seemed untouchable. Mark gestured toward me. "Mr. Cole, I understand you wanted to present something." I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. For a moment I hesitated. I wasn't a speaker, not a man of polished words or public speeches. But this wasn't about eloquence, it was about truth. "Thank you," I began, my voice steadying as I spoke. "I never wanted to stand in front of any of you like this. My wife and I moved here because we believed in community, in the kind of place where neighbors look out for each other, not tear each other down. But what we found was fear. Fear of fines, fear of judgment, fear of a woman who mistook control for leadership." I could feel the room tighten, every ear tuned to my words. I took a deep breath. "Valerie Henson didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. She harassed families, bullied seniors, and violated privacy. My wife was attacked because that woman believed she was above empathy, above decency, above the law." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see nods. Quiet, restrained, but real. I lifted the small projector I'd brought from home and connected it to the clubhouse's screen. The first video flickered to life, the footage from our doorbell camera, showing Valerie peering into our nursery window late at night. Gasps filled the room. Then came the emails, her voice recordings, her written threats, and finally, the video of the assault itself, the kick, the fall, the chaos. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt physical. When it ended, I turned back to them. "This," I said quietly, "is what happens when silence becomes complicity. But we don't have to live like this anymore." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mr. Chu rose from his seat, his voice trembling but clear. "He's right," he said. "We let fear rule us. No more." Others began nodding, murmuring agreement. Mrs. Patel stood next, then the Hendersons, then a dozen more. It wasn't loud, not yet. But it was a groundswell, a quiet revolution rising from years of submission. Mark looked around, clearly overwhelmed. "We'll hold an immediate vote for new leadership," he said. "And we'll begin the process of rewriting the community charter to protect residents from abuse of authority." That night, the vote was unanimous. Valerie was permanently removed from her position, and the board agreed to establish a rotating leadership system to prevent anyone from holding power for too long again. When the meeting ended, people lingered outside, talking freely for the first time in years. Children ran across the grass, laughter echoing through the twilight, a sound that hadn't existed in Willow Glen for far too long. Mara and I walked home slowly under the glow of the streetlights, She leaned against me, her hand resting gently on her belly. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," I corrected her. All of us. For the first time in months, the air felt light again. The weight that had settled over the neighborhood was gone, replaced by something fragile but hopeful. A week later, we got the call that Valerie had been formally charged and transferred to the county jail pending trial. The DA intended to pursue full sentencing, assault, harassment, and violation of state HOA laws. I didn't rejoice. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something quieter, the kind of peace that comes when justice aligns, when truth finally outweighs fear. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks after her arrest, a letter arrived at our doorstep. No return address, just our names written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single page, hand-scrawled, erratic but unmistakably hers. "You don't understand what you've done," it read. "Order must exist or chaos wins. I kept the neighborhood pure. I kept you safe. You'll see. They'll destroy it without me." Mara read it silently, then folded it neatly and handed it to me. "She still thinks she's the savior," she said softly. I nodded. "She can think what she wants. But we know the truth." We gave the letter to Detective Harris, who sighed and tucked it into his file. "She's unraveling," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change what she did." In the months that followed, Willow Glen began to change in ways small but profound. The newsletter no longer came with threats or citations. Instead, it carried photos of community gardens, announcements of block parties, and kind notes welcoming new families. People waved again, genuinely, not out of obligation. Kids played in the streets without fear of a reprimand. Even the lawns grew a little less perfect, but somehow more beautiful in their imperfection. And as Mara's due date approached, our house filled with visitors bringing gifts, advice, and laughter. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid confrontation now came bearing casseroles and love. The sense of community Valerie had always preached about, hollow and controlled, was finally real, born out of empathy instead of fear. On the night our daughter was born, the whole neighborhood lit their porch lights in celebration. When we brought her home wrapped in a soft pink blanket, a crowd waited quietly at the end of the street, clapping and cheering as we stepped out of the car. For the first time, I understood what community was supposed to mean. Valerie's trial was scheduled for the following month, but by then, the neighborhood had already delivered its verdict. Her reign had ended not with rage but with unity, and though the scars she left behind would take time to heal, something beautiful had risen in their place, proof that even the darkest moments can sow the seeds of light if you refuse to let hate win. That night, as I stood by the nursery window watching Mara rock our daughter to sleep, I thought of all we'd endured, the fear, the pain, the injustice, and realized something simple but profound. Sometimes, the people who try to break you are the very ones who teach you how strong you really are. And in that quiet moment, beneath the soft glow of the nightlight and the rhythmic breathing of the woman I loved, I whispered a silent vow to our child, that she would grow up in a world where kindness ruled louder than control, and where no one would ever again mistake cruelty for order. The trial of shadows. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, a scent that somehow felt both comforting and unsettling. It was early morning when I arrived with Mara, the air outside cool enough to raise goosebumps on her skin. The crowd outside the steps was larger than I expected, journalists with microphones and cameras, neighbors clutching paper cups of coffee, curious strangers drawn by the strange fascination of a story that had turned suburban perfection into public spectacle. The once private world of Willow Glen had become a headline. As we entered the building, the echoes of footsteps and murmurs followed us down the marble hallway. Every sound seemed amplified, every glance loaded with unspoken judgment. We took our seats behind the prosecution's table, and for a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to look toward the defense side. But eventually I did. There she was, Valerie Henson. Even in custody, she carried herself with an eerie dignity, her hair neatly pinned, her suit pressed, her expression calm in a way that chilled me. It was as if she still believed she was in control, as if this entire trial was another meeting she presided over, another vote she intended to win by intimidation. Her eyes flicked across the room, pausing on me and Mara. The corners of her lips curled ever so slightly into something that wasn't quite a smile. Mara's hand tightened around mine. I could feel the tremor in her fingers, the quiet storm of emotion she tried to suppress. "It's okay," I whispered. "She can't hurt anyone anymore." When the judge entered and the proceedings began, the hum of the courtroom faded into silence. The charges against her were read aloud: harassment, assault, unlawful surveillance, coercion, and several counts of emotional and psychological abuse linked to her role as head of the HOA. The prosecutor, a firm but calm woman named Laura Kent, presented the case with the precision of a surgeon. Every word, every exhibit, every image carried the weight of months of fear and years of silence finally breaking. The first witness was Detective Harris, his steady voice detailing the evidence, the security footage, the audio recordings, the emails. When the doorbell video played on the courtroom screen, showing Valerie's shadow outside our window, a ripple of unease moved through the audience. Her lawyer tried to object, claiming invasion of privacy, but the judge shut it down quickly. Valerie's composure didn't break, but her fingers twitched against the table. Then came the testimonies from the neighbors. Mrs. Patel spoke of being fined hundreds for having non-regulation curtains. Mr. Chu described Valerie entering his backyard without permission, claiming to inspect fence alignment. One by one, people stood and told their stories, voices trembling but resolute. They spoke of intimidation, humiliation, and the quiet dread that had settled over Willow Glen for years. And then, it was Mara's turn. The room fell silent as she stood, her posture frail but her voice firm. She recounted everything: the late-night messages, the threatening letters, the confrontation that ended with her lying broken on the pavement. Her words were simple, but they carried more power than any argument or photograph could have. There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. And somehow that made it even harder to listen. When she finished, even the judge looked momentarily shaken. Valerie's defense attorney rose slowly, a man with sharp cheekbones and a talent for subtle cruelty. He tried to reframe everything, painting Valerie as a woman devoted to order, misunderstood, overzealous perhaps, but never malicious. "My client," he said smoothly, "was simply enforcing the standards agreed upon by all residents. If some felt uncomfortable, that's unfortunate, but not criminal." But then Laura Kent stood again, her voice steady and razor-sharp. "Order doesn't justify obsession," she said. "Discipline doesn't excuse cruelty. Ms. Henson didn't protect her community, she terrorized it." For the first time, Valerie's face flickered. A small crack appeared in the mask she wore so perfectly. Her jaw tightened, her nostrils flared. It wasn't rage, it was something deeper. Fear, perhaps. Or the dawning realization that her empire of control was truly collapsing. When it came time for her to testify, the courtroom shifted in mood. Everyone leaned forward slightly, unable to resist the gravitational pull of her presence. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and approached the stand like a queen ascending her throne. "I did what I had to do," she began, her voice low but clear. "You all talk about fear, but none of you understand responsibility. Someone had to maintain order. Someone had to make sure this neighborhood didn't fall apart like the rest of the world out there. I gave structure. I gave peace. And this," she gestured vaguely toward me and Mara, "is how I'm repaid?" Her words were calm, but her eyes glowed with intensity. She spoke of protecting standards, of preserving the image of stability, of upholding the promise of perfection. It was chilling how she framed her tyranny as devotion. Laura Kent let her speak for a few minutes longer before stepping closer, her tone clinical. "Ms. Henson," she said, "you broke into people's property. You assaulted a pregnant woman. You spied through windows. Is that your idea of peace?" Valerie's composure cracked then, just slightly. "You think chaos brings peace?" she snapped. "You think letting people paint their doors pink and let weeds grow and hang gaudy lights brings happiness? That's not a community, and that's anarchy." The courtroom gasped. Even her lawyer sank slightly in his seat. "Order without compassion isn't leadership," the prosecutor said softly. "It's tyranny." And for the first time, Valerie's eyes dropped. The woman who had ruled with absolute certainty suddenly looked lost, like someone realizing that the world had moved on without her permission. The trial lasted several days. By the time closing arguments began, the mood had shifted completely. The jury didn't see a misunderstood leader anymore. They saw a woman consumed by control, someone who had mistaken power for purpose. When the verdict was read, guilty on all major counts, a collective breath released across the courtroom. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. A long, heavy, trembling exhale after years of silence. Valerie stood motionless, her face pale and unreadable. When the bailiff approached to escort her out, she turned one last time toward me and Mara. Her lips moved soundlessly, but I could read the words. "They'll ruin it without me." And then she was gone. That night, the sky over Willow Glen glowed faintly with the first touch of spring. The neighborhood gathered for an impromptu celebration, though no one called it that. It was more like a quiet acknowledgement that something dark had lifted. Tables were set up on the cul-de-sac. Music drifted through the warm air, soft laughter mixing with the hum of conversation. Someone brought lanterns, someone else grilled food. And for the first time in memory, the street was alive after sunset. Mara sat beside me, our daughter cradled in her arms, her small fingers reaching for the light. Around us, neighbors smiled and talked openly, trading stories and jokes without the fear that had once shadowed every word. "Do you think she meant it?" Mara asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the night sky. "What she said, and that they'll ruin it without her?" I looked around at the laughter, the imperfect but beautiful chaos of freedom blooming in the street. Someone's dog barked. Children chased fireflies, and a few unevenly hung lights flickered across porches. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. "No," I said finally. She was wrong. Order built on fear doesn't last. This, I gestured to the small world around us, this will. As the night deepened, I thought about Valerie, not as the monster she'd become, but as a person. Someone who must have started with good intentions before something inside her curdled. Maybe she believed she was saving people. Maybe she feared the chaos of a world that had once hurt her. Or maybe she just couldn't bear losing control. Whatever it was, she had built her cage out of rules, and then forced everyone else to live inside it with her. But in the end, even cages built from order collapse when love and truth push back hard enough. When the party finally dwindled and the last of the lanterns dimmed, I stood outside for a long while, feeling the faint pulse of life returning to this place. The wind carried the scent of lilacs and grass, messy, unregulated, alive. I realized then that perfection was never the goal. It was connection. It was forgiveness. It was the courage to rebuild. And as I walked back inside, the baby's quiet breathing filled the air like a promise. A new generation would grow up in a neighborhood where no one watched through windows, where no one feared their own community. The shadows had passed and the dawn was ours to shape. The quiet rebuilding. The weeks after the trial passed like the slow unthawing of winter. Willow Glen, once wrapped tight in fear and conformity, began to breathe again. It was a strange and beautiful process, like watching sunlight touch a house that had been dark for too long. The lawns, no longer perfectly trimmed to HOA specifications, began to show a touch of personality. Someone painted their mailbox bright yellow. Another neighbor hung a wind chime shaped like a crescent moon, its song soft and defiant. For the first time in years, laughter came from front porches. Children played past dusk and people talked without glancing nervously at the corners of their homes. The silence that had once filled the streets was replaced with the messy, comforting noise of life. For Mara and me, recovery was a journey made of small steps. The first time she took a walk around the block without hesitation felt like a victory. She still moved carefully, her body slowly healing from what Valerie's cruelty had done, but her spirit, that radiant, stubborn light that had always defined her, was coming back stronger than ever. Our daughter, born healthy despite the chaos that preceded her arrival, became a living symbol of resilience. Every time she smiled, I was reminded of how close we had come to losing everything, and how love had carried us through when logic said it shouldn't have. I remember one morning in particular. The sun was low, golden, pouring across the kitchen floor. Mara was humming to our daughter as she fed her, and the simple domestic rhythm of it, the spoon tapping against the bowl, the baby's soft laughter, was almost holy. It was the sound of peace earned, not granted, the kind of peace that comes after surviving something that should have broken you. But peace, I learned, does not erase scars. It simply allows you to live alongside them. Despite the verdict and the collective relief that followed, Valerie's presence lingered like a faint echo. Her house stood empty for months, Its shutters closed, its lawn overgrown, a silent monument to obsession. Some residents avoided walking past it, whispering that her energy still clung to the walls. Others wanted it demolished entirely, as if erasing the physical space could cleanse the memory of her reign. But time has always moved forward, and eventually a new family moved in, a young couple with 2 boys and a dog that barked joyfully at every passing car. Their laughter filled the space where commands and surveillance once ruled, and that alone felt like redemption. One afternoon, I received a letter. It came from the county correctional facility. The envelope was plain, the handwriting precise and familiar. It was from Valerie. I stared at it for hours before opening it. Her words were not what I expected. There was no apology, but there was no venom either. Instead, it read like a confession, or perhaps a lament. You won, Mr. Granger, but winning doesn't always mean you were right. I see now that I built my rules out of fear that everything I loved would fall apart without order. I thought structure could protect us from pain. I didn't understand that it can also create it. They've assigned me to a therapy program here. They tell me I'm supposed to confront my motives, but all I see are ghosts of intentions gone wrong. Still, I wanted you to know I didn't hate your wife. I envied her peace. I mistook it for arrogance because I could never find it for myself. Take care of your child. Don't let her grow up believing perfection is love. I read the letter twice before folding it and placing it in a drawer. It didn't absolve her and it didn't reopen wounds. It simply existed. A fragile piece of truth from someone who had finally begun to see her own reflection clearly. In the months that followed, I joined the newly formed neighborhood council, not an HOA, but a simple community group built on voluntary participation and transparency. No fines, no bylaws, no power games, just people trying to make their little corner of the world kinder. We organized small things, shared gardens, weekend cleanups, family movie nights projected on garage doors. For the first time, Willow Glen wasn't a place of judgment. It was a place of connection. The change was subtle but profound. I noticed how people began to reclaim their individuality. The Hendersons, who once whispered apologies for their noisy toddlers, now hosted Saturday playdates in their driveway. Mr. Chu turned the ruins of his prized azaleas into a flourishing pollinator garden that attracted butterflies from blocks away. Mrs. Patel started a book exchange on her front porch, and me? I built a small wooden bench beneath the maple tree in our yard, the same spot where Mara had once been confronted and hurt. I built it not to erase what had happened there, but to reclaim it, to turn pain into a resting place. Every morning I would sit on that bench with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise. Sometimes Mara joined me, our daughter bundled in her blanket between us. We didn't need to speak. The quiet said enough. And yet, there were nights when I would wake from dreams of that day, the flash of movement, the sound of impact, the chaos that followed. Trauma is a strange companion. It doesn't always leave when the danger does. It lingers, asking to be acknowledged rather than ignored. On those nights, I'd step outside, breathe the cool air, and remind myself that the world we'd built now was real, that the fear had passed. One evening, almost a year after the trial, Mara suggested we attend the town's Spring Festival, an event that had been canceled for years under the strict HOA rules. The theme this year was Reclaim the Light. The name alone felt symbolic. We walked there hand in hand, our daughter toddling ahead, her small laughter blending with the music and chatter of the crowd. The park was alive, lanterns swaying from trees, local musicians playing, families dancing barefoot on the grass. No one cared about the exact shade of their picnic blankets or whether their shoes matched their shirts. It was beautifully imperfect. I remember turning to Mara and seeing tears glisten in her eyes. We made it, she said softly. After everything, we're still here. Yes, I whispered, pulling her close, and we're better for it. That night, as fireworks painted the sky, I thought about how far we had all come, not just from fear to freedom, but from silence to voice. Valerie's shadow had once loomed over every decision, every breath. Now her name was just a story parents told their children as a lesson about power, control, and what happens when fear disguises itself as order. But deep down, I didn't hate her anymore. Pity, maybe. Understanding, perhaps. Because I saw in her what happens when someone mistakes control for purpose, when the need to protect turns into the need to dominate. She had built her empire on fear, and it had collapsed under the weight of truth. Life went on. The seasons changed. Our daughter grew, fearless and curious. Sometimes, when she toddled across the lawn and plucked a dandelion, I thought of the old rules Valerie once enforced. No weeds. No disruptions of landscape harmony. I smiled every time. The weeds, I realized, were what made the garden real. In a way, Valerie's downfall gave birth to something far greater than justice. It gave us back our humanity. People began to trust again, to care again, to be unapologetically flawed and beautifully human. The sterile perfection that once defined Willow Glen was gone, replaced by warmth and authenticity. And on the anniversary of that terrible day, the day everything changed, we held a neighborhood picnic beneath the maple tree. Everyone came. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, just laughter, food, and stories. At one point, someone asked if I ever thought about moving, leaving this place that had once been tainted by so much pain. I looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight, at the sound of children chasing each other through the dusk, and I said quietly, "No, this is home." We rebuilt it and we earned it. As the sun set and the sky turned violet, I felt something inside me finally settle. Not the sharp satisfaction of revenge, but the deep, steady peace of closure. Valerie had once believed she was the keeper of order, but in truth it was the people she tried to control who had carried the soul of the neighborhood all along. Perfection was her prison. Forgiveness was our freedom, and in the end that made all the difference.